Thank you for joining us today. My name is Catherine Van Ness, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to NGA's webinar on strategies for supporting students experiencing homelessness during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar will highlight lessons learned during the past year and a half and share strategies for supporting students experiencing homelessness. Please note this is the fourth in an ongoing Reflect and Redesign series of webinars that will look at lessons learned during the pandemic and elevate state and local exemplars that can inform gubernatorial efforts during and beyond the pandemic. Please check out our earlier webinars on state education budgets, re-engaging students, and summer learning and enrichment at the NGA website. And be on the lookout for forthcoming webinars on student and staff well-being and engaging families and communities. Today, I am pleased to engage in conversation with a national expert on a very important topic. Barbara Duffield is the Executive Director of SchoolHouse Connection, which is a national nonprofit organization working to overcome homelessness through education. Considered the nation's leading expert on the early care and education of children and youth experiencing homelessness, SchoolHouse Connection has a vision that students experiencing homelessness have full access to quality learning opportunities. As I said, such an important topic, so I want to jump right in. Barbara, can you start by sharing who this population is? Give us that picture of who students experiencing homelessness are.
Sure. So students experiencing homelessness are a broad and diverse group. I think it's really important by way of context to understand that when we are talking K-12 education, early childhood, or higher ed, we're talking about a definition of homelessness that is broader than what most people might think. So this encompasses children, youth, and families who are staying with other people temporarily because they have nowhere else to go. That's actually the largest group. There's not shelter in most communities. Shelter is full. People are afraid of shelter. So the reality is that it's largely a hidden population. This is also families and youth who may be staying in motels, regardless of how the motel is paid for, as well as staying in shelters or transitional housing, campgrounds, cars, some of the typical places. But I think the larger point to make is just that it's largely a hidden population, but it's an experience that many disadvantaged children and youth will have. So students experiencing homelessness are disproportionately students of color. Students with disabilities are more likely to experience homelessness, English learners. It's an experience that disrupts education and creates unique barriers to education. So it has to be part of our equity conversation, but it also requires its very specific and intentional focus. And just the last piece of context that I would add is that the role of education is obviously critical in terms of the immediate social safety net and basic needs for children and youth who are experiencing homelessness, but it's also a critical part of ending the overall problem of homelessness, because we know that lack of a high school degree is the single greatest risk factor for continuing to experience homelessness as young adults. So just a little bit of context about the population. It's 3 to 5% of the student population is experiencing homelessness as identified. So it's also a larger student population experience than most people would think.
Yeah, thank you for setting the scene there. And as you said, education has such an important role to play in ending the experience for future generations. So hopefully that is a number that continues to decrease over time. We know that governors have focused extensively on closing the digital divide during the pandemic, but what were some of the challenges that emerged during remote learning for this population of students? And did you see any particular successful strategies to reach students experiencing homelessness? Or if not, do you have recommendations for ways to improve in the future with reaching these students?
The single greatest problem faced by students experiencing homelessness and remote learning, or one of the beginning of the problems was just finding them, identifying students experiencing homelessness. We couldn't close the digital divide for these students if we didn't know who they were, where they were, or how to stay in touch with them. So we saw, for example, we did a survey of school district homeless liaisons in the fall of 2020, about a 28% drop in the number of identified homeless students, And that wasn't because magically homelessness went away in the pandemic. It was because during virtual learning, the eyes and the ears of the school system, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, coaches, counselors were not there to identify. So our biggest challenge in closing the divide was that identification issue, and then staying in touch. Families and youth were moving a lot. You can't stay at home if you don't have a home. So a very, very mobile population that became more mobile. So finding ways to stay in touch, regardless of where families and youth moved, so that the technology troubleshooting could happen. And like all disadvantaged students, devices and Wi-Fi were an issue, but even having a place to recharge devices when libraries or campgrounds and other places were closed, where to even plug in. So that was a challenge. And then just the learning environment, not having a quiet and a safe, stable place to be for digital learning was part of the divide that our students experienced. In terms of the strategies, we saw even more creative outreach to identify students experiencing homelessness, flyers everywhere, PSAs, public service announcements put out by superintendents, mayors, and others, regional coordination, but also just door to door, following safety protocols, obviously, in terms of finding students and getting the word out. Staying in touch with students, many districts turned to prepaid cell phones, hotspots, and really doing more regular check-ins as families moved so that they could stay in touch and again troubleshoot the technology and other issues. So those are some of the strategies that have been employed and that will continue to need to be employed as we're not out of the pandemic, and certainly post-pandemic, the need and the impact will still be there.
Exactly. We've seen the importance of that personal touch and that one-to-one, visiting and outreach to students and families certainly has arisen during the pandemic, and would be a positive thing to keep post-pandemic, as you said. So we know that everyone from governors themselves to educators and parents, everyone is concerned about unfinished learning and the gaps that were highlighted by the pandemic. We know that these gaps existed prior to the pandemic as well. So what do gaps in academic opportunities look like for students experiencing homelessness? What recommendations do you have for academic recovery efforts to try to close those gaps? And how might next summer play into that as an opportunity to leverage here?
Sure. The gaps in academic opportunities for students who are experiencing homelessness, much is just very basic participation. Are they enrolled? Are they attending on a regular basis? Are they able to participate fully? Because if you're not enrolled in school, you're not attending regularly, and you're not able to fully participate, there will be your academic gap. So part of the challenge for students who are in a homeless situation is their mobility, but there are other enrollment barriers and participation too. And specifically for some populations of students who are homeless, like youth who are on their own, are unaccompanied homeless youth. So all of those, they're navigating homelessness without a parent or guardian, and so have additional barriers just to the very basic participation in education. Also for students experiencing homelessness, like with other students, just the impact of trauma and mobility that surrounds homelessness, that contributes to academic gaps. It's very hard to focus when you have all of those things going on. So I think we need to talk about the social, emotional, and trauma, and we talk about the academic gaps. Parental death, very significant always for student homelessness, but particularly with COVID. So there's usually layers. And the other piece about the gaps in academic opportunities is just, again, to note the disparities. So we know, for example, pre-pandemic, the graduation rate for students experiencing homelessness was about 12 percentage point below other students living in poverty, below economic disadvantaged students. So we know that there's an impact that homelessness has above and beyond just being poor, but also within this population of students experiencing homelessness, we see the same systemic issues for students of color who have, again, those additional layers of challenge and trauma that they're experiencing. So we need to pay attention to homelessness as a whole, and then within the population of homelessness, students of color and students with disabilities and students who are English learners. Proactively, recommendations for economic recovery, and you mentioned this too, but the importance of people, of having academic coaches or mentors who are specifically focused on students experiencing homelessness or have part of their time to be focused on that. High dose tutoring is great, but you have to have somebody who's following you, who says, where are you today? Who's following up and really following through with all of that. Also attendance. And these are the end goals of graduation and transition to post-secondary are there, but attendance is the one very daily piece that we can be paying attention to. So what that means, obviously, is people who are focused on where these students are they coming, why are they not coming today? Also things like transportation. And I know that's going to come up later when we talk about some of the staff shortages, but really being creative with the transportation options that these students have. Because again, if you don't have something as basic as a way to get to school or a way to get to an after school program, you're not going to be able to benefit from it. We also know credit recovery and credit accrual are going to be very important for our students who have gaps and to be able to close those gaps. Sometimes state policy plays a role in that. So we're very active in state policies that can enhance credit accrual and recovery. And then the last thing I'd say too here is just to be very mindful of the gaps that are continuing to happen during quarantine. So when we send students home because of an outbreak, if you don't have a home to go to, you can't access education, we're continuing to see those gaps for our most vulnerable students. And yes, absolutely, summer will be a critical opportunity to leverage, but that means getting to know our students and families now so that we can be in touch with them over the summer and not lose touch as we get into the summer months.
Absolutely. I appreciate you breaking down so many of those contributing factors to the academic gaps and some of the unique challenges that students experiencing homelessness are facing. Attendance, of course, is that first step, and examining that will be so important. And as state leaders are planning for this summer, that recommendation of reaching out and building some relationships now is certainly an important one. And so to dig in a little bit deeper, of course, the pandemic disproportionately impacted these students, as you mentioned. What are students' holistic needs right now? You touched on, increased rates of parent death recently, but how are you seeing schools try to engage with these students as some of them have been able to return to the classroom? How might they be engaging with families and communities right now in meeting students' holistic needs?
Yes, the move towards the whole child education is always imperative. Students are always whole people, but especially right now. So some of the things that we are seeing in terms of needs, if you can think about just all the things that we take for granted when we have a safe and stable housing. So just having a safe and a stable place to be, thinking holistically, if you know that where you're going to go to after school and it's the same place and it's a safe place. So that stable housing piece, stable housing situation, obviously food. If students aren't at school, they're not getting fed. And even during the pandemic, we saw that some of the most, heroic action schools took to make sure that students fed, still there were gaps if students didn't have transportation, for example, clothing, hygiene. And then big part of meeting holistic needs is having those caring adults, somebody who knows your name, somebody who's following you, someone who is asking sensitively questions that might help them help you. And as big conversation too around holistic needs is mental health and just all the extra layers of trauma and knowing that it lasts. So we need to have that in front of our minds as we think about our re-engagement strategies. So, moving from those holistic needs, particularly for this population, to re-engagement, and we're really focused on reestablishing trust as a larger conversation around race equity, and many low-income parents having lost trust in public schools. And so who do they trust? And seeing our school district liaisons try to really increase their engagement with community-based organizations, faith-based partnerships, and other organizations representing families to get their trust back, to re-engage them. Another big strategy is really engaging those youth and those parents who have lived experience of homelessness in the re-engagement strategies. There's nothing like hearing from somebody who's gone through it, what they need to be re-engaged, showing up and supported in their education, and really have trust, and that people are believing in them, that they can and will succeed. Part of that too, for this population specifically, is increasing the number of dedicated points of contact. And under federal law, every state agency, education agency has a state coordinator, every school district is required to have a liaison, but really increasing those dedicated points of contact. So maybe at the school building level, within early education, within higher education, because if it's not part of someone's job, that it ends up being no one's job to track and re-engage this population in particular. Looking at incentives as well for appropriately done for our students and families to re-engage them. And this generally, again, increasing kind of the dedicated hours. So obviously I know we're talking next about staffing shortages, which is a real thing that is impacting us, but thinking about different ways to just increase the peopling of this issue of finding and supporting our students experiencing homelessness and really re-engaging them in school.
Yeah, and we can dive right into that. I mean, with the importance of that relationship, that caring adult following a student, especially if they are mobile more so than other students and peers. How are the current staffing shortages across the education system impacting them? Are you finding gaps in services that you want to highlight for state leaders, particularly with the influx of federal funding? Anything that they should be paying particular attention to make sure that students experiencing homelessness have their needs met right now?
Yes, well, one specific impact of staffing shortages, and I mentioned it earlier, is transportation. It's very basic, but it's essential. And so being mindful, particularly when we have a federal requirement that requires school districts to keep children and youth who are homeless in their school of origin. So we have school stability, they're going back to the same place. School can be the same place, even if their housing situation changes every day. That requires transportation. So being mindful of that and thinking about how districts can be working regionally, creatively. That's, seems like that word out of the box. People are like been out of the box for a long time and still looking for different ways, but we have to think about how we resource the transportation challenges. Just anecdotally, we had a liaison who was sharing that she, with COVID relief dollars, which I know is the next question, was able to get approval to purchase a van for her students experiencing homelessness. But then she was told that she has to be the one to drive it. And so even though there's an entire transportation department trained to drive it, they won't do it. And, she's already stretched thin herself. So she's already routing taxes for the department, purchasing, bus transportations, et cetera. So that's just one really real example. Some of the solutions about transportation hubs, even in rural communities, hearing about engaging farmers to help transport, because they get up early in the morning, they're ready at the beginning of the school day, they already have licenses to drive vehicles. So really taking on transportation as one of the gaps and one of the areas where staffing shortages is having a specific impact on students experiencing homelessness. And then the other big gap I want to focus on is the gap between public schools and housing agencies and the homeless system. We saw with rent relief and the eviction moratoria and all of government effort to address the eviction crisis, but schools were left out of that. And that can't be. When we have billions of dollars that we need to spend to keep families housed, schools need to be at the center of that response, not ancillary, not just as a referral system. So would really want to focus on bringing together housing agencies and schools directly, not having the middleman of the homeless assistance system there necessarily, but trying to forge those relationships for school housing partnerships. Because again, schools are on the front lines. They can see immediately a family that's behind. If they can expedite rental assistance, as some counties did, we can prevent homelessness, improve school stability, improve outcomes. So would really like to see a closing of that gap specifically, whether it's with COVID dollars or state housing funding, but really bringing schools and housing agencies together.
And the critical role that governors play is that convening, space for various state agencies. And so that is a great recommendation for our audience here, to think about how schools and housing authorities can work in partnership for these families that are struggling. And while everyone has faced these challenges over the past year and a half, especially for our underserved students and students experiencing homelessness, is there anything that you are excited about looking to the future? Of course, we've talked about the opportunities that could come with these unprecedented levels of federal funding, but do you have anything that you're excited about and any recommendations for governors and state leaders who have access to those funds?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. What we are most excited about is the fact that Congress in the American Rescue Plan allocated $800 million specifically to support the identification and enrollment and participation of children and youth experiencing homelessness. We advocated strongly for that because we saw with the previous ESSER funds that although students experiencing homeless were eligible, the funds weren't being directed that way. So we now have an appropriation that's 8 times the annual appropriation, and so important in so many different ways, particularly in the now, but also in the future. These are more flexible funds, so they can be used in ways that are different than the regular McKinney-Vento dollars. They also, the Department of Ed has really emphasized working with community-based organizations, particularly those serving historically underserved populations, to subcontract with to do some of the wraparound supports that are so important. So we've been doing a lot of work with states and local agencies on the implementation of these funds, and thinking about it again in the now, but also in the future, building bridges to early childhood and higher ed as well. In terms of some of the opportunities specifically for governors and state leaders to leverage the fundings for these students, one important piece I think is really addressing this perception of the cliff. For example, one state agency was not able to, or said at this moment, she wasn't able to have additional support at the state level because there's a perception that this is one-time funding. But it doesn't need to be one-time funding. It's only 1% of the K-12 federal education budget. So certainly we're advocating it for continue, but also there are other existing funds that can help sustain that. So really being mindful of the people that it needs to take to braid the funds to sustain them, and the impact of having an infrastructure there. And I know this is a challenge with other COVID funds as well, but really particularly with these funds, we need to make sure we have the infrastructure in place. And that means people who can be working, particularly with districts who've never, ever gotten homeless dedicated funds before. So we're super excited about that, but we need to make sure we have the infrastructure in place to get to use the funds wisely. And the other real opportunity, I think, for governors and state leaders, actually 2 more. One, again, is to mention the school housing partnerships and bringing agencies together, but also thinking about state dollars or private dollars that could supplement those. So, for example, many districts are hiring with our American Rescue Plan homeless children and youth dollars. They're hiring housing navigators or systems navigators, which is great, but you have to have something to navigate with. So, we're encouraged by those positions, but want to make sure that whether it's state dollars or private, that there really is the opportunity to bring those various relief funds together. And then the last piece I just want to say is, and particularly for the role of governors and state leaders, is state policy reform that can enhance and help leverage these funds. So we're very engaged in state policy, whether it's school discipline policies, for example, in Nevada just passed, or high school graduation policies, or state policies that would allow young people to be able to consent to shelter or even vital documents, really looking at removing those state policy barriers that might prevent youth and families from accessing COVID relief funds and accessing the support that's available. And that's from early childhood all the way through post-secondary.
Really important points, and thank you for calling attention to some specific pieces there that governors can focus on as part of the recovery. We've been hearing a lot about the idea of a fiscal cliff, but there are a lot of needs that need to be met as soon as possible for these students. And so great recommendations there for ways to spend not only the federal dollars, but other sources of funding as well to kind of make that more sustainable into the future. Barbara, thank you so much for sharing all of these insights today and taking the time to join us. And thank you to those who have tuned in. Please note that all of relevant reports and resources to accompany this webinar will be posted on the NGA website. So until next time, thank you for listening. We hope you and your family stay safe and well, and have a great day.